Good evening, and welcome once again to the Eclectic Radical. If you've watched the show before, you will recognize my former co-host, Alex Suarez. How are you doing tonight, Alex?
Good to be here.
I'm glad you're doing well. I'm doing pretty good myself. Just getting out of a funk. The end of the year always does that to me. But it also helps me think, beginning of a new year. And one of the things I think about a lot, is history. And I've been thinking with some of the news from Latin America lately, I've been thinking that we're seeing a lot of the stuff that we used to see, especially with this bit. I don't remember. I don't know if you've been paying attention or not, but that rather than just being the ordinary CIA coup, have you heard that Steve Bannon is connected with the coup in Brazil the same way he and a bunch of his fundraisers were connected with the alleged trucker convoy in Canada that was really recruited by a couple of white supremacists from Alberta?
So I don't know about Steve Bannon connections with the Canadian truckers, but I have heard that I believe one of the nephews of Bolsonaro is connected to Steve Bannon.
He was and Bolsonaro's son was apparently nephew. It is the nephew. Was it January 6th
in DC?
Yeah, he was at January 6th as one of the people storming. And yes, it came out that Steve Bannon and a lot of the usual Republican donor suspects who donate to all sorts of far-right causes and projects, including people like Ginny Thomas, had all donated to the trucker convoy in Canada, the same way they donated to the January 6th attack or the Brazilian coup.
I don't want to get into too many details, but I'm planning an action with a select group of comrades in Orlando at the end of the month in order to confront Bolsonaro and the right-wing Brazilian exile community there. Several of the masterminds behind the recent coup attempt in Brazil fled in advance to Orlando, which isn't too far from here. And, I'm not sure how involved Steve Bannon was, but I can tell you that DeSantis is protecting because they chose his state.
But what's
protecting the Brazilian criminals.
You know whose town Orlando is, right? And whose county Orange County is?
What are you gonna say, Zimmerman?
No. The former chief of police of Orlando, before going to Congress, was Val Demings.
Oh yeah, I know about Val Demings. She lost when she ran last.
Yeah, she lost for the Senate race,
right?
And then the former county sheriff, now county mayor, is Val Demings' husband. He was county sheriff at the same time she was police chief, and now he's county mayor at the same time she's in Congress.
Is Demings her maiden name, or is that her husband's name?
I don't know. I have to do more look. I have to do more look into that. But I know I've known about that tidbit for a while because I have friends in Orlando itself who keep me caught up on who used to keep me.
Well, I've been focused on the Brazilian community there.
Yeah, I understand.
There is a rich MMA fighter from Brazil. Can't think of his name. I can look it up. But he owns a huge residence, a huge complex in Orlando, and they're saying that's where Bolsonaro's staying. But there's a guy, I think his name's Anderson Torres. So Mr. Torres was head of the federal security in Brasilia, in the nation's capital, where the coup attempt happened.
Yeah, former minister.
And he fled within a few days of before it happened, also to Orlando. So Bolsonaro and his cohorts were masterminds of this. I'm convinced of that. But if you want to get chronological, we can get into what happened with Alex Saab first.
Yeah, well, we should talk about Alex Saab first. I do want to say that the history. Thank you. The MMA fighter is Jose Aldo.
Yes, Mr. Aldo. She's correct.
And as you point, and Anderson Torres is both the chief of police of the chief of federal police of Brazil in Brasilia, right. Which is he was in charge of law enforcement when this happened and fled before it happened.
Right.
Which is weird. Why do you flee if you're in charge of law enforcement? Because you know something's going to happen. And then the second thing is that he was Bolsonaro's minister of security. So he was in Bolsonaro's cabinet before he was the police chief.
Right.
Which is also which also tends to lend credence to your theories.
Well, the governor who suspended Torres, the governor of Brasilia, he's been he fired Torres, but he's been suspended himself. And there was approximately 150 people that were arrested since the siege of 3 buildings in Brasilia. But before we get into that,
well, so I was going to talk about the history first, which is just that the U.S. has a long, long history of messing around in Latin America. You can go all the way back to the Mexican War, which is the first time we stole territory from another country in the Western Hemisphere. And then you can go directly from that into our invasion of our occupation of Veracruz in Mexico.
I would say it was the first time we stole land from a Latin American country.
Yes.
Because there were country or nations of native people that had their land taken immediately.
That's a good point. Where was I? Oh, so the Mexican War, of course, and then under Woodrow Wilson, we occupied Veracruz in Mexico, Haiti, as well as the 3 countries of the Northern Triangle. That was before El Salvador was independent, but we did occupy Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua. All at the same time, under Woodrow Wilson. And we did not finally leave the last of them until under Herbert Hoover. So we stayed we had troops in, I think the last country we were in was Guatemala.
Just excuse me a second. I'm going to plug my computer in. I'm listening, though.
Sure. Until Herbert Hoover was president. As from Woodrow Wilson to Herbert Hoover, we were fighting wars in Latin America while saying we were at peace.
Right.
They called them the Banana Wars because they were fought largely on the behalf of the United Fruit Company, now better known as Chiquita Banana.
Well, the second CIA coup, which was in Guatemala, was done at the behest of the president of the United Fruit Company, who was the brother of Dulles, the head of the CIA. Talk about a conflict of interest.
Well, there are lots of conflicts of interest. But yeah, well, I think at the time, though, Dulles' brother had just become Secretary of State.
Well, just like, Halliburton with Dick Cheney.
Yep.
In Iraq.
Of course.
The clearly conflict of interest. The brother ran United Fruit. And I don't recall if he was given a position in the government and left United Fruit to one of his cohorts, but that was his company. And the company still exists, but it has a different name now.
Yeah.
It's Chiquita Banana. But I believe the term Banana Republic stems from that because of the dictators that
Banana Republic,
the behest of the United States to look for the interests of the corporations.
Banana Republic goes back to the Banana Wars. The governments they set up in Guatemala and Nicaragua and Honduras were called Banana Republics by people in the U.S. And it's sort of interesting how that history goes, because the Banana Republic.
Tell me if I'm wrong. It was meant in a derogatory way as well, much like the term, the backyard of the United States and North America.
So the Banana Republic originally referred specifically to the fact that an American corporation had controlled these governments. Chiquita Banana in this case. Whereas now Banana Republic seems to mean some backwards country that isn't as advanced as others, usually isn't white, and it's become a derogatory term. But it specifically referred to governments set up by U.S. invasions for corporations. And then before that, even worse, you had, this is also where the word filibuster in the Senate comes from. So this is a good fact to know. During the period before the Civil War, American pirates, brigands, whatever you want to call them, who called themselves filibusters, were traveling all over Latin America and the Caribbean as private citizens, trying to cooperate with local resistance groups in order to set up pro-slavery countries. The best examples of these are the Narciso Lopez revolution in Cuba, where a group of so-called independence fighters supported by slaveholders from Florida and Alabama landed in Cuba and tried to take the country over from Spain. And it went badly, and Narciso Lopez got executed.
I mean, Brazil had slavery till the 1880s, right? So
yeah,
even when it was abolished in Mexico and South America and other parts of South America, Brazil maintained that, and Brazil had connections with North Americans, slave owners as well. That some of them migrated to Brazil after it was abolished in the United States after the Civil War.
Some Cuban slave owners migrated to the U.S. after slavery was officially abolished by the Spanish. Now, there were all sorts of tricks in Cuba to keep various labor systems that were very near slavery going in various forms
quasi-slavery
independence. But the Spanish had very, very recently abolished slavery, and the desire for bringing Cuba into the U.S. was all these slave owners would then be able to rely on U.S.
In the early 1500s, they abolished slavery against indigenous people in the Spanish territory, not in the Portuguese, because of the influence of priests like Bartolome de las Casas, who wrote about the civilizations that were being crushed there, and also a lot of the natives were dying off from smallpox and also from just the repression. And so they brought in their replacement, being the sub-Saharan African slaves.
But the thing,
it took much longer for the abolishment of slavery for them, though.
No, that wasn't abolished until the 19th century. I mean, it wasn't very long between the abolishment of slavery in Cuba and the American Civil War. Slavery was abolished by the Spanish. Then the Cuban thing happened. After Cuba did finally get its independence, the things that Americans had been trying, the pro-Confederate stuff, happened anyway, and they found ways to let people keep a labor system that was a lot like slavery. But at the time but that was why they thought that they would be able to take over these countries so easily. They thought all the big landholders who wanted their slaves back would back them up. A man named William Walker successfully took over Nicaragua for a year or two before they took the country back.
This was before Sandino, right?
It was before the Civil War. Walker was executed in the 1850s. The Cuban thing happened in the 1850s. This is where the filibusters came from. These people were running around Latin America trying to take countries from the Spanish to reinstate
how did it end
slavery.
up as a term meaning blocking legislation in Washington?
Well, which was done by Southern senators who were calling themselves filibusters after the original.
So it was like a way to solidarity with the filibusters that were operating in Latin America.
Are we talking, Connor, about William Walker, who tried to take over Nicaragua for the Confederates?
Walker's a pretty common last name. I don't think he's
Yeah,
talking about the same person.
he was
He
also,
probably came in before you mentioned which William Walker you're
the
referring
same
to.
William Walker. Funny, but true. The same William Walker was mayor of San Francisco and got a reputation as mayor of San Francisco as an honest, heroic guy who cleaned up the town. But he also tried to overthrow the government of Nicaragua to reinstate slavery.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people. For example, there's a lot of sympathy in the left for environmentalists, but in the name of environmentalism or conservationism, which is a little bit different but similar.
Yes,
you had people like Teddy Roosevelt, who was in Cuba, by the way. He meddled in Cuba as well with the Rough Riders. But you had Teddy Roosevelt that made these national parks to conserve the land, but really what it was doing was stealing Native American land. I mean, a good example is also Mount Rushmore, which was a sacred mountain to the Sioux people.
Oh, yes.
Putting the form of the founders' faces on it was a huge insult to them. And this is a part of history that's largely ignored.
Well, fun fact. The guy who who did the original sculpture and carved Mount Rushmore was also hired by Confederates to design the Stone Mountain Memorial in Georgia. Somebody else ended up doing the actual sculpting because there was a fight over the people who commissioned it and Borglum over his pay. But he designed Stone Mountain too. And so Mount Rushmore is just a sort of less treasonous redoing of Stone Mountain, but for the same white supremacist purpose. They literally wanted to carve Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and Roosevelt into the geography of the country.
You know why Bolsonaro doesn't flee to the Amazon? There's a lot of impenetrable areas within the Brazilian Amazon. Because all the natives there hate him.
All of the people in the Amazon who aren't there to despoil it want to kill him.
Exactly. Because he went after all those native tribes and on behalf of the cattle ranchers and destroyed the environment there. And so those natives would happily turn him over to Lula. Lula, one of the very first things he did when he took over again was pass legislation that's pro-indigenous, pro-Amazonian tribes to protect that land once again.
Hey, Zayna,
so those people despise Bolsonaro.
Yeah. Well, everybody, I think everybody in Brazil who wasn't making money off of Bolsonaro despised him. And probably even some of the people who were. I mean, my view of a lot of these billionaire types is they don't like politicians very much. Not really. They see them as the help.
They want to use them. That's it.
Yes, exactly.
I'm not sure Bolsonaro is. I know you're not talking about Bolsonaro when you said billionaire, but I think he's only a millionaire, right? I mean, some people even say Trump is only a millionaire.
There are some billionaires in Brazil, but I don't believe Bolsonaro is one of them.
Right. But he's backed by them. He's backed by
and by American Wall Street types. Wall Street loved Bolsonaro. Bloomberg used to love to say great things about Bolsonaro until he started seeming to be too pro-Russia.
So do you want me to go into Peru next or Alex Saab? I got some good information.
Let's start with Saab. The main thing I wanted to finish was that, so we have filibusters in Brazil, the Bannon people going down there to help.
Oh, okay. So you're saying it's kind of a reemergence of the history there.
It's the same. We've got filibusters in Brazil and we got a banana war in Peru.
Yeah, because your title on the YouTube confused me. Now I know what you mean, how it's connected.
That's why I wanted to get that out there. But that's where the title is from, folks. Banana wars are when the U.S. government deliberately goes down into Latin America and takes a country over for a corporation, like they tried in Bolivia, like they've been trying in Venezuela, and like they're trying right now in Peru.
And actually, bananas are not indigenous to the Americas.
No, they
were first brought by the Spaniards who encountered them in the Canary Islands.
Yes.
The Arabic word for toe or finger, and actually in Spanish, dedo means both finger and toe.
On the other hand,
but the Arabic word for finger and toe is banana.
On the other hand, potatoes do come from America and not Ireland.
Right. And so when they found in the Canaries, North African and Arab people that had bananas, when the Spaniards asked them what it was, they said banana.
Yeah.
And so that's what they called them. And they brought the banana seeds to the Caribbean, and then it spread, to other parts of the Americas.
Yeah.
Because if you look at a map, for example, of Western Sahara, right? Yeah. I met Western Saharans that speak very good Spanish. There used to be a Spanish colony while in Venezuela. And right now they're occupied by Morocco. They're being oppressed by Morocco. But the Western Saharans, if you look at the map, they're extremely close to the Canary Islands.
Yes.
Basically, the Canary Islands used to be like a western part of the greater Western Sahara nation.
Interesting.
And a lot of them went exiled to the Canary Islands. They could just take a boat from the coast of Western Sahara. It's like right there. And some of them also went to Algeria and Libya. So a lot of the leftists in Algeria and Libya supported the Western Saharans fight against the Moroccan crown that was subduing them. Yeah. Mauritania, for example, was forced out by the Western Saharan militias, but they weren't powerful enough to throw out the Moroccans. So they still control. They're still under Moroccan control.
Yeah, no, I knew that, and they'd been occupied almost since Spain.
Well, almost immediately after the Spaniards left.
Yes,
the Mauritanians and the Moroccans came into the Western Saharan area.
Yep. No, I remember that because when I was a kid, I'm so old. When I was a kid, there was a Warner Brothers cartoon called Animaniacs. And they had a song called The Country of the World, where they just sang all the countries of the world in order and pointed them out on the map. And as they were going through North Africa, they're calling out the countries. And then to rhyme with something else, they say, Spanish Sahara is gone. Because, of course, on the globe for years, you had Spanish Sahara where Western Sahara is now.
Did you know that Cleopatra's daughter was ruler of Mauritania?
Yes, it was.
She was the daughter of Mark Antony.
Yes,
and Cleopatra.
Well, Mauritania was
fled Egypt when Caesar Augustus took over, and she ended up becoming the queen of Mauritania. So when people say Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of a North African nation, that's not true.
Well, she was
Mauritania is part of North Africa. It's just on the other side of the continent.
Yeah, but Mauritania didn't have a pharaoh. Mauritania had kings and queens.
Well, she was descended from the pharaohs because
just like her
mother,
wasn't a pharaoh.
She not only was she descended from the pharaohs like her mother, but she was descended from the right-hand man of Alexander the Great. So she had Macedonian blood as well.
One of the people who tried to claim to be the right-hand man of Alexander the Great. That was one of the things the fight was over. They all claimed to be his right-hand man.
Yeah, but he was one of the closest collaborators of Alexander, which is why he was able to get his body, and they buried it in Alexandria.
Well, I buried it in Alexandria because that was what his will said to do, and they weren't ready.
Yeah, but they weren't sure.
Will there? No, they did later kill his queen.
They weren't sure, and there was multiple Alexandrias, but yes, it was going to be Alexandria, Egypt. But they weren't sure who was going to rule over Egypt, which was one of the most important regions, because he was so close to Alexander, and they couldn't dispute that. That's why he was able to. I forget his name, but he was a direct descendant of Cleopatra.
Ptolemy was an ancestor of Cleopatra. Yes,
right.
Cleopatra was not
several generations
a Macedonian colonizer.
Right, because several generations had passed by the time the Romans became more dominant over the Greeks. and their influence had greatly shrunk. Whereas Ptolemy had controlled large parts of the Middle East on the other side of the Red Sea too. Right.
His heirs lost all that to Seleucus and his heirs.
Yeah, because Ptolemy. Now I remember his name. Yeah, Ptolemy. He had control over Syria at one point as well.
Well, yes, and then Seleucus, who had been originally put in charge of Babylon, got into a war with Ptolemy and took Syria from him.
Right,
and then Seleucus's heirs took more of that part of the Middle East down in what's now Israel and Jordan and Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan.
For those that don't know, Babylon is modern day Iraq, pretty much.
Yes, Babylon is modern day Iraq, and Persia is modern day Iran.
And Babylonia,
whereas
and also Assyria is both northern Iraq and southern Syria.
Modern Mauritania, however, is much smaller than the country that we talk about when you talk about classical Mauritania.
Classical Mauritania included a lot of parts of what's Western Sahara today.
Well, it went all the way from Morocco to the Atlantic coast of North Africa on the one end. And on the other end, it bordered with Numidia around where the Moroccan Algerian, is it? Or Moroccan Libyan? I don't remember which way I have them turned around.
Well, Morocco has no land border with Libya. It has a land border with Algeria. Algeria
is between Libya and Morocco. That's what I thought. So yeah. Algeria and Libya were a country called Numidia.
I've heard of Numidia.
And so at the time that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were doing their things, they were trying to set up a political settlement for the East and Africa that would outlast them. And one of the things they did was they married Cleopatra's daughters to the kings of Mauritania and Numidia. And they named Cleopatra's sons kings of Syria and Nabatea, which Nabatea is in the area of Palestine now.
But I think it was pretty dramatic how her daughter fled and ultimately ended up in Mauritania because Caesar Augustus was trying to kill all their descendants.
Yes, because
she was under the protection of the Mauritanians, and there was nothing Caesar Augustus could do at that point. She became queen.
He specifically wanted to kill all of her descendants because her son, Caesarion, was believed by everyone in Egypt to be the legitimate son of Julius Caesar by what they considered a legal marriage to Cleopatra.
Yeah, because Julius Caesar's undisputed son died, and so then he adopted his great nephew, who was Caesar Augustus.
Well, he adopted Caesar Augustus because Caesar Augustus was Roman.
By the way, I'm talking about his undisputed son who was 100% Roman.
Well, so his son died very young. Caesar never had a legitimate son. Caesar had one child, a daughter named Julia, who he married to Pompey.
That's not what I heard. I heard that he had a child that died young. That was a male.
No, he had one child, a daughter named Julia, who was married to his first ally and then enemy, Pompey.
Yeah, Pompey.
And
Pompey was killed by Cleopatra. Pompey was killed by Cleopatra's brother.
Pompey was killed by Cleopatra's family, but yes, it was her brother who was in charge at the time.
Yeah, he was very young. The regents ran things.
Yes.
So the regents ordered his beheading because they thought that Julius Caesar would be pleased by that.
They thought it would make
Julius Caesar pissed him off.
Them, and instead he invaded and put Cleopatra in charge.
Right. It pissed him off, and so he went to the rival of the brother, who was Cleopatra, and opted for her to be his ally in the region instead.
Yes. And that was a big deal at the time. But
get to
his only son, his only legitimate, Rome didn't consider it a legitimate marriage because Cleopatra wasn't Roman.
They considered him half barbarian because they didn't, even though Cleopatra had Macedonian blood. I mean, they considered the Macedonians or Greeks
Augustus
barbarian, let alone the Egyptians.
Augustus was absolutely terrified of anybody in Rome seeing Caesarion, because after Augustus saw him, he realized, oh shit, he looks exactly like Julius Caesar.
Right.
Supposedly. And since and Augustus was apparently killed the kid because he looked exactly like Julius Caesar, and he figured everyone would believe that he was his kid and not care that he was half Egyptian if they ever saw him.
I looked it up, and it looks like you're correct. Julius Caesar had two biological children, and one adopted child who was Augustus. He also had a stepson. I don't know if he
Yes.
adopted him, but the stepson, they said, was the one that did the coup de grace, who was Brutus.
So he never married Brutus's mother. Brutus's mother was his mistress, his very famous mistress. His love letters were delivered. Her love letters were delivered to him on the floor of the Senate while he was arguing against the execution of the Catalinian conspirators. Catiline was a general who tried to take over Rome, who allegedly tried to take over Rome not long before Caesar did in the general scheme of things. And the crushing of his revolt led to a famous debate between Julius Caesar and Cato the Younger about capital punishment. And Caesar gave a long speech about why the state should not murder people.
Well, also Cato represented the elite. Julius didn't.
And Caesar, and that's where it gets complicated. Cato was was from a family that was low-level elite, and they were very much in the pocket of more powerful families. And but yes, he was on the side of what they called the optimates, or the best people. And Caesar was a populari, or a populist in modern language.
But there was rumors that Brutus was actually Caesar's son.
There were, yes, because of the famous affair between Servilia and Caesar during the debate.
But I doubt it's true. He ended up being one of the ones that assassinated him.
But during the debate between Cato and Caesar, a love letter from Servilia was delivered to Julius Caesar on the floor, and he took the letter and read it and hid it. And Cato, who was Servilia's half-brother, it's very important to understand that Servilia's mother was also Cato's mother.
I didn't know that.
Servilia's father was Quintus Servilius Caepio Jr., who was a minor Roman commander.
And Junior would be the younger, right?
Yes. And his father, Quintus Servilius Caepio Sr.,
the elder,
was primarily famous for losing a battle against the Gauls after stealing the biggest buried treasure any Roman general had ever found. So he stole this huge treasure, and his son Caepio Jr. inherited it. And then Caepio Jr.
How did we find out about the love letter? Did Cato figure it out and expose Caesar?
Cato demanded to see the love letter because he said, that comes from Catiline. Give it to me so I may read it to the Senate.
He knew
Caesar handed it right over.
He said that to manipulate him.
And Cato starts reading this love letter from his older sister to Julius Caesar out loud on the Senate floor. And about halfway through it, everybody realizes what's going on and it starts laughing at Cato. Now, Cato won the debate. They killed Catiline and all his co-conspirators. But Cato was laughed at. And what everybody remembered was that Cato was laughed at.
So you think Cato didn't know it came from his half-sister and then embarrassed himself?
Cato acted like he believed it was from one of the conspirators to Julius Caesar. And Cato had even at one point accused Julius Caesar of being the real leader of the conspiracy and not Catiline. Because Cato didn't like Julius Caesar.
Right.
But anyway, so Cato made all these accusations, and Julius Caesar handed over the letter when ordered, and Cato read it out and was like, oh, you're sleeping with my sister. Okay.
That made him pissed off at him even more.
Yeah, well, Cato's son was also one of the people who stabbed Caesar.
Interesting.
Cato was dead by that point. He had killed himself. But Cato's son was one of the people who stabbed Caesar, along with Brutus.
Did they ever use the third? Because I know there's always younger and elder for
So,
junior and
so they
senior.
didn't. So senior just meant you were someone's father, and you and your son had the same name, the same way we use it now. Likewise, junior. So you would only call someone. You would only call someone junior if their father was still alive and had the same name. But of course, at least one son always had the same name as the father, because that was how Roman
So there was
families.
no the third. If the
There
grandfather,
wasn't a third of the third. No, because you have to remember how Roman names worked. So if your name was what's Sextus Julius Caesar, just as one example, that meant you were the oldest brother in the family. And as the oldest brother in the family, you were named Sextus every time. Your father might also be a Sextus. And if your father was also a Sextus, then you would be Sextus Julius Caesar Jr. If your name was Gaius Julius Caesar, that usually meant you were the second son. Gaius Julius Caesar's father was the second son of another Gaius Julius Caesar, but his older brother's name was Sextus. But for some reason, they jumped over the usual first name and named their oldest son Gaius. Or maybe maybe he had an older brother who died that history has forgotten.
So let's try to get to the present, because
now's where we get back. Alex Saab.
I'm going to probably only speak for about an hour this time. So I got information on, of course, Alex Saab, and also some information on Peru, because there was unfortunately a successful, at least for now, coup in Peru in recent times. So.
Yes, there was.
What do you understand? Well, let's go on Alex Saab, since you want that first. What do you understand so far of what Judge Scola's decision was?
Well, as I understand it, basically it's bad. They don't appear to be letting him go the way they should. They're not honoring diplomatic immunity, as far as I can tell.
But it's important to understand how insane it is and how dangerous it is.
That's why you're here to explain it.
Right, because the federal Judge Scola, and I looked at his eyes, I looked at his face. I literally attended every arraignment and hearing that there was. Nobody else has done that. As a matter of fact, before these 3 hearings, I was the only supporter inside. The lawyers are not supporters; they're paid to defend him.
Yeah.
So this time, because of pressure from me and others, there was a huge group of people that entered the courtroom this time, because I was complaining. I was like, come on, guys, we need to enter this time. And so there was I would say half the protesters outside entered the courtroom. So there was about 30 of us that were outside. So 15 of us were inside. And it changed the atmosphere of the courtroom. For example, the prosecution kept trying to ask one of the Venezuelan witnesses on Zoom about the Guaido government in Mexico. They're like, isn't it true that Maduro canceled the negotiations between the Guaido government and his government in Mexico after Alex Saab was extradited to the United States? And the witness was such in shock by the question. It wasn't because of lack of translation. It was clearly spoken to her in Spanish, right? I'm fluent in Spanish. The translation was very good, but she was in such shock by the question that she had to have it repeated again. And when they said it a second time, I'm laughing. 3 or 4 other people are laughing in the courtroom. Obviously, people that are against Alex Saab, a lot of them are so stupid they think there is a Guaido government, so they wouldn't laugh. But there were several of us laughing, and the judge didn't hit the gauntlet or nothing. He just held his head down in shame. He knows what he's doing. And we were laughing with how ridiculous the question was. And her answer was spot on. She said, there has never been a Guaido government, nor in Mexico, nor in Venezuela, nor anywhere else. And then she said, "Are you talking about the Venezuela-Mexico meetings?" Like, so, just the way the prosecution presented their questions was completely void of fact.
Yeah.
And within days of the decision of the 23rd of December, which was the Judge Scola's final decision in regards to the diplomatic status hearing, now it's on appeal in the 11th Circuit. But by the 23rd, a couple of days later, when he made his decision, a few days after that, the opposition, I'm not talking about Maduro, the opposition parties in Venezuela voted to dissolve the fake interim government of Guaido.
Yes.
So
I remember that.
What is the prosecution going to say on appeal? What can they say? There's an invisible president that doesn't exist. And because we recognize that invisible president,
we don't even recognize him anymore.
He's not a diplomat. Because that's what the judge said. The judge said because we don't recognize Maduro, and we're
no.
Guaido,
we don't recognize Guaido anymore.
I know. Yeah. So when the opposition dissolved his party, dissolved his leadership in the party.
Yeah.
And not only, he already had lost his post in the party before that, but when they dissolved his fake government, when nobody now calls him
in that election,
when that happened, they didn't bring up a fake president. So it's only Maduro now. What leg did the prosecution have to stand on?
And Biden has been negotiating with Maduro to try to buy oil.
Right.
So
that's already been successful, Chris, because Chevron has sold some of their oil to Venezuela, and there's already been prisoner exchanges. Maduro's nephews were returned to Venezuela.
Yeah.
They were held on trumped-up charges. Americans have been returned. There's still some Americans.
What is even the justification for holding Saab at this point?
Because
let me do recognize Maduro essentially.
Well, let me get into this. This is important because I'm going to forget. First off, it's important to understand that there's a special envoy right now, Special Envoy Carstens, who you got to understand this guy because how important he is, because he's gone to Iran, he's gone to Russia, he's gone to Venezuela. He goes to these countries and he's pretty good at negotiating. He's successfully gotten Americans out of those countries. He successfully negotiated oil purchases because, as you know, we have a Russian oil embargo.
Of course.
The United States has been reaching out to other countries to try to get access to their oil, unlike they were doing before. So Carstens, who's been complicit in the sanctions, which are illegal, I'm not saying he's a saint. I'm just saying he's a good negotiator. He's gone to these countries and done these functions as a special envoy. Now, this is what's important to understand. According to Judge Scola's decision, because when it comes to law, you can't be hypocritical. It has to apply to everybody equally.
Exactly. So
according to Judge Scola's decision, not only does North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc., any country that's sanctioned by the United States, not only do they have a right to capture Carstens at any time, but they have a right to capture him in a third country that's allied to them. Because remember, Alex Saab was captured in Cape Verde.
He was
heading to the United States. So that gives them full legal justification at any time in any of his missions to capture Special Envoy Carstens now. That's what Judge Scola did. He put our envoys in danger because he's saying because the United States doesn't recognize Maduro that we have a right to capture any of their special envoys.
The United States does recognize Maduro.
So then that means if Venezuela doesn't recognize Biden because we have no diplomatic relations, at any time they can get Carstens' next mission to try to get more Americans out. That's the danger that Scola caused us.
This is where I have to speak up, but essentially the United States does recognize Maduro now.
That's the thing. They're saying that they accept that Guaido is no longer the president. Even his own party has said that. And so at the same time, they're not saying Maduro's the president. Basically, there is no president of Venezuela right now. It sounds insane, but that's technically what the situation is right now.
That's ridiculous. That's the best.
Because the Biden says the words, "I recognize Maduro," they have to release Alex Saab immediately. And they still think for some stupid reason it's a good idea to hold on to him. They've tortured the guy for more than 2 years, physically and psychologically. He hasn't given up anything on Maduro. So I don't know what they think it's going to change all of a sudden. There's really no reason to continue to hold him. It's just
and even if he were, what is there to give up on Maduro?
I don't know.
See, that's the whole thing is, I mean, the only reason that I can see for holding him is to make a point out of actually holding him prisoner. So this is just the deliberate kidnapping and imprisonment of someone from another country because
Well, they also want to
like
make an example out of him, like they made an example out of Assange, just like.
But
yeah.
I mean, so I'm not in any way trying to justify what's happening to Assange, but Assange is a private citizen without diplomatic immunity. There's a big difference between. So let's pretend.
Let me answer that. So the only profession mentioned in the Constitution is journalism.
Sure.
Journalism is the only profession that has constitutional protection.
Mm-hmm.
So Assange, who's not even an American, so I don't know why they're accusing him of treason, has press passes, has won awards in journalism. And so, they're not respecting his journalistic protections. We have other laws outside our Constitution, like the Vienna Convention that we've signed on to, that respects diplomatic immunity. But the precedent that Scola sent by saying that any country that we don't have
diplomatic immunity isn't legit,
it puts everybody in danger.
Yeah, well, he's basically saying we don't have to recognize diplomatic immunity if we don't want to.
I want to make another point before I forget. It's worse in some ways than when they invaded the Venezuelan embassy. You remember, I was one of the protectors or defenders of the Venezuelan embassy in 2019 in D.C. And at that time, the late Kevin Zis, who was a lawyer, when the authorities initially tried to invade the embassy, he sent them back. And he told them, go back and speak to your superiors, because if you invade this embassy, it's going to put all our facilities at risk. And of course, they still ultimately invaded. But now it's not even a question of facilities. It's capturing diplomats, even in third countries that are not even heading to the United States. So in some ways, it's even worse. And this proves it doesn't matter if it's Biden or Trump. There are other forces that run imperialism.
And I've heard Michael McFaul whine about this all the time, left and right. Oh, Putin wants to get me. But, I mean, they've basically said if Putin wants to have Michael McFaul kidnapped, they're cool with it. And I mean,
and so if I was Special Envoy Carstens, I mean, this is why I probably would have got all A's if I took international relations classes. But I never took any classes of international relations because I would never want to be a diplomat of an empire. Mm-hmm. But if I was Carstens, I'd probably get myself fired, but I would come out immediately and make a press conference after this decision and say, this puts me in danger. And also any moment, at any time, Biden has the full legal right to pardon Saab. And the Venezuelans have expressed publicly that they're willing to do an exchange with the remaining American criminals in Venezuela. So Biden, at any moment, he's being pressured by the family. Even the sister of one of the Americans held in Venezuela has said, you need to exchange from Alex Saab. That came out recently. So Biden, at any moment, he doesn't have to wait for this trial. Like, let's say he called Scola and Scola said, no, I still want to hold Saab, which I doubt very much happened. But let's say that happened. Biden has the authority as a president to immediately pardon Saab in exchange for Americans. But he doesn't want to do that. Why? I think one of the reasons why is because he always fears more the right than the left.
Whoa,
so he wants to appeal to the right wingers and look hard on Venezuela. But it's
Biden always wants to look tough for Republicans. He always assumes Democrats love him and that what matters is looking tough for the Republicans. I don't love Biden, but then I guess I'm not a Democrat either. So
he's made statements when he was asked about African Americans, like, you're not black if you don't vote for me.
Yeah, I remember that.
This is the type of imperial arrogance that we're talking about. And I think part of it is Judge Scola is so arrogant that he's blind to the obvious conclusions you can make by these decisions. And also, quite possibly, Biden does want him to hold Alex Saab for as long as possible. And he's offered him some type of backdoor deal. He could have told him, hey, you want to be in the Supreme Court when one of our justices die? Do this, and even though you're violating all the principles of international law.
I think it's a mistake to put either Biden or Trump too close to some of this stuff, simply because a lot of it.
Though? This is why I disagree, because if you look at the history of the Nuremberg trials, for example.
I'm not saying that they're not responsible or that they're not guilty in the end.
Let me make my point, and then you can respond to it. So during the Nuremberg trial, American judges were consulting Washington every day on what was the best way to deal with the Nazi criminals.
Yes,
it's the same thing. We're at war. It's a new Cold War. It's an economic war. And I'm convinced that Scola has been in consultation, if not with Biden, at least with Blinken.
Well, so here's what I'm going to say about that. So when it comes to, so there's such a thing as momentum in government agencies. Government agencies are all working in a specific direction for the most part, regardless of who's president. The directors change when the president changes for some agencies, not all of them. But even when the directors, even when the directors change and the deputy directors change, you've got a lot of senior people whose positions don't change because they're there out of quote unquote seniority and merit.
By the way, I want Mina to not Google the word Alex Saab on Google. You're going to get about 500,000 lies before you get to a truth. What you need to do is Google free Alex Saab.
Yes.
The moment you Google the words free Alex Saab, you'll get factual information. There's freealexsaab.org. They did a review of my book called The Diplomat. That's in a few languages now on the Alex Saab case. So, yeah, I mean, you're going to see 500,000 different articles that defame him and say the most absurd thing, that he's a DEA agent or a foreman or whatever. So, you know, it's going to turn off a lot of leftists that are not familiar if they just put in Alex Saab on Google. It's one of the worst things they could do. They would get a lot of misinformation before they would get to a truth.
And if he were a DEA agent, why would we be arresting him and torturing him?
Let me tell you, there's been people that have entered the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. And I'm somebody, in case people are familiar with me, who was on lecture observer in Venezuela last year, invited by that party. There was also people in the opposition that were observers, and they all accepted the decision of those regional elections. But there are people that have entered the United Socialist Party, like people that infiltrate any party here that are corrupt. And those people that were able to successfully flee to Miami, that were not captured by the Chavista authorities in Venezuela, they were given mansions. The United States loves when there's corruption. They love to steal from the Venezuelan people. That's what the whole sanctions are about. They reward Venezuelan exiles for doing that, even if they were former Chavistas or claimed to be Chavistas. What they're doing against Alex Saab is because he won't be corrupt, because he refused to say any lies from Maduro.
One of the victims of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting was the daughter of a Venezuelan banker who came to the U.S. after the banking scandal to not get prosecuted.
Exactly. And a lot of them are under the protection of the U.S. government, just like Bolsonaro's under the protection now of Governor DeSantis. So if you steal from your nation and you flee the United States, you're 9 times out of 10 going to be rewarded. So what they're doing now is because he refused to sell out, because he defied U.S. sanctions, and they're trying to make an example out of him.
The Shah of Iran retired to the U.S. after he was...
Well, he was brought in by the United States in the first CIA coup at the behest of British Petroleum.
Yes, but they also wanted to. But the U.S. was also originally willing to let Khomeini take over because they had been embarrassed by the story of the Shah's torture chambers that had run in Playboy and Penthouse, and they were also really unhappy with the fact that the Shah was trying to push OPEC in a conservationist direction that would have been bad for U.S. foreign policy. So they abandoned the Shah and let him go down because they thought it would help them with OPEC. And now in the future, we have a Saudi Arabia that would rather do business with Russia than the U.S. almost.
And who are on the verge of joining BRICS, by the way.
And this is what I mean by momentum. Everybody in the U.S. loved Bolsonaro, despite his Trump associations, up until he kept going along with the BRICS stuff. And did what needed to be done
There was
with
something
Russia.
else too. There was something else too.
Yep.
So there was only one country that was willing to use their land for a U.S. land invasion of Venezuela. There was U.S. mercenaries that entered Venezuelan territory through Colombia, which is not surprising. There's U.S. bases in Colombia.
Oh, yeah.
There are no U.S. bases in Brazil. And Bolsonaro, because he wanted to show himself a nationalist. This is probably the only good thing he did in his presidency, besides be part of BRICS. And I'm not saying BRICS is great either, but at least it makes a counterbalance.
Well, but let's remember.
But the only good thing he did. Let me say what the only good thing he did was first, though.
Sure.
Was not permit his land. To be used as a ground invasion against Venezuela, not out of any sympathy with Maduro. He despises Maduro.
Yeah.
But because he wanted to show himself as a nationalist. But go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. Bolsonaro's the BRICS thing was a Lula project. Lula Lula was the one who signed the original treaties. And Bolsonaro, this is the deep state. And there are conspiracies that are connected to the deep state, but it's not so much conspiracies as just the fact that if you're a professional who's in the number 5 job at the State Department or the CIA for 20 years, you're the person that every Secretary of State is asking for advice because you have more experience than them. And in a very real sense, these top professional people in agencies like the State Department and the FBI and the CIA and these handful of political appointees who go back and forth through these various national security positions, no matter who's president, like Chuck Rosenberg, who served in various offices under both Bush and Obama. All these guys, these are the real deep state. These foreign policy and military policy guys who stay there for 20 years in a number 4 or number 5 spot at the very top level below all the political appointees.
Or the very first person that coined the deep state was a Turkish person, right?
Yes. Well, Turkey is where the term comes from. And the term deep state in Turkey referred to, there aren't as many of them as there used to be now, but originally in Turkey, the term deep state referred to Kemalists in the military. These were the people who would start a coup.
Ataturk.
Yes, they would start a coup every time a Muslim fundamentalist president was elected, because they didn't want a fundamentalist government. They wanted a secular government. And then somewhere along the line, they lost their power, and Erdogan became the real. But yeah, no, the deep state always referred in Turkey to the Ataturk / Kemalists who wanted a
biggest threat to American democracy
state
right now, because the overwhelming majority of Americans are pro-choice, overwhelming, are the Christian fundamentalists. The influence of the Christian fundamentalists is so dangerous. That's why they're able to infiltrate the Supreme Court, and they were able to reverse Roe versus Wade, and also because democratic cowardice as usual.
Also, you have to look at the relationship between Christian fundamentalists in the U.S. and Sunni fundamentalists around the world. The U.S. gives Saudi Arabia lots of military aid, and Saudi Arabia's military establishment is one of the leading funders of Sunni extremists all around the world.
Right. But what does that have to do with Christian fundamentalists?
Christian fundamentalists run the Defense Department.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So
what you... Oh, that's not new.
Well, I knew that they used religious justification in Iraq, but I didn't know they were up in the Pentagon.
Well, so the thing to remember is that the military is a very Christian organization, which is not to say that everybody in the military is a fundamentalist, but there's a lot of God and country stuff that goes along with the military. And military families have a tendency to go to the same churches and become a little conservative as time goes on.
Wasn't there the founder of Blackwater's sister was like Secretary of Education under Trump, and she's a Christian?
Yes, Betsy DeVos, who
So a
is,
lot of the
yes,
mercenaries are Christian fundamentalists. That's true too, and they've infiltrated the
yes,
military, of course.
Blackwater was founded by Christian fundamentalists, as was, while the commander in the field was, and the owner of record is Jewish, the money for the Wagner Group also came from Christian fundamentalists in Russia. There was a whole lot of
Wait a minute. That one of the oh no, was it Wagner? It was Wrangel.
Yeah.
It was a famous white guard in Russia during the Civil War.
Yes,
but I was confusing the names. So you're talking about an American group.
No, Wagner Group is essentially the Russian version of Blackwater.
Okay, so maybe the Wagners and the Wrangels were related. I'm not sure. I think they were related.
Wrangel was at the time of the Russian Civil War. Wrangel was a Swedish officer an officer from a Swedish Russian family. Sorry.
Right.
An officer from a Swedish Russian family who fought with the whites in one part of the Russian Civil War. He was one of the leaders.
I think he was in Ukraine and he fled to Crimea or something when they lost.
Yeah. Something like that. I don't remember all the exact details of where everybody was, but that sounds approximately right. But yeah, no, Wrangel was further back. The Wagner Group is much more modern. Essentially, the best way you can look at it is the Blackwater people were a bunch of kooky, religious, ex-military and ex-intelligence folks who wanted to start their own outfit. And it was sort of the same thing with the Wagner, I hate it when I can't talk, the Wagner Group.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of the same similar idea. They wanted to be this.
Well, they would be pronounced they'd be pronounced Wagner by the Germans, right? Because that's how they pronounce their W's.
Yes, it would be Wagner by the Germans.
Right.
Which is why I keep saying it wrong. Because I keep thinking of Wagner whenever I think of Wagner.
I heard in Cincinnati, for example, there's a large German community there, and when you speak to somebody or somebody German descent from Cincinnati, because the word bitte means both please and excuse me, when they want to say excuse me in Cincinnati, they say please. They get that from their German family.
Bitte, yes, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, no. But so Christian fundamentalists in the U.S. establishment work with specifically in the CIA, work with Muslim fundamentalists in all sorts, usually Sunni, in all sorts of countries, originally to fight communists and now to fight Shiites.
Well, do you know that the Shiites in Bahrain are secular? They have alcohol.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
They're friendly with Iran, but they're more, secular type of Shia.
Well, so that's the thing. Iran is the only Shiite country that is really anywhere near as theocratic as Saudi Arabia. Most Shiite countries.
Tell me if I'm wrong, because I could be wrong on this. But I thought the only other country that was majority Shia besides Iran was Bahrain.
Bahrain, there aren't. I don't know if there are. There used to be. Well, no. Iraq has always been a majority.
Oh, you're correct. I forgot. Iraq is because Shia, and those are Shia that tend to be secular too.
Yes, they also tend to be more secular Shia. The Iranians, who have always been Shiites, were one of the most westernized countries in Central Asia before the Ayatollah.
But by the way, I read an article once about how Iran became Shia. Originally, it was Sunni, but one of the grandsons of Muhammad was in Basra in southern Iraq, where he was killed by the Sunni, and that's when the split started. But even after that split, east of that region, like where Persia is, a lot of people were Sunni. But then later they were converted to Shia.
Well, they became So the thing to remember is that while there were pro and anti Umayyad and Ali parties, the Shia Sunni divide was a reaction to Ali's death.
Right.
And the Shia were always in a minority in the beginning because the Umayyads had power.
Wait a minute. Wait, wasn't Ali the father who was the cousin of Muhammad? Who
Ali was
also
Muhammad's.
if I may, Ali was one of the imams. He was the brother-in-law. I'm sorry, he was the son-in-law and the cousin of Muhammad, the
He was
prophet.
the son-in-law and cousin or nephew of Muhammad. Yes.
Right, and so it was his sons that were killed in Basra. One of them was
his son Hussein.
Hussein, yep.
Who was killed in Basra. Ali himself was assassinated in what's now Persia. Persia,
I was not aware of that.
Persia was the seat of Ali's support while he was in power.
But I heard that even the Sunni recognize Imam Ali, who they don't recognize his
Again, we have to remember that the split came later and everybody recognized Ali as one of the rightly guided caliphs.
Right.
A lot of Sunni even say bad things about the people who overthrew Ali, even if they like some of their successors.
Right.
So everybody agrees Ali was a good guy, and that he.
By the way, was Ali killed before or after the son?
He was assassinated before.
Okay, that's interesting.
Hussein tried to mount a rebellion later and was killed in the course of the rebellion.
Right.
And it was Hussein, and after Hussein's death, his descendants were the quote unquote true imams. The first Shiite government were the Fatimids in Egypt, who briefly overthrew the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, and named themselves caliphs.
Yeah.
And they were eventually thrown out. But Iran and Iraq were majority Shia for years and years and years. Because
I heard the word California comes from the caliphate because of
Califia, Queen Califia.
Right, because of there was a book, like a mythological book in Spain that takes place in Arab times when they had caliphates, and then the word California derives from that.
So the queen's name was Califia, and yes, it was from the book was written by a Spanish. The book was written in Arabic by a Spanish Jew.
Yeah, probably Sephardic.
During the I hate it when I can't talk.
During the
Emirate of Cordoba.
Cordoba, yeah.
I can't keep all the various governments straight some days. But so during the Emirate of Cordoba, the book about Queen Califia was written. Queen Califia was the leader of a tribe of Amazons in a mythical kingdom discovered by the explorer in the book.
Right.
And Cabrillo, the man who quote unquote discovered California, though he never actually landed, Cabrillo saw what he thought was an island off the coast and said, "That's where Queen Califia is from," and named it California.
That's funny.
It is.
Well, can I get into Peru now?
Please.
So a lot of people are not understanding the situation. So they think that they think that Pedro Castillo, the former president, overstepped and brought them on himself. And another incorrect assumption that a lot of people are making, even people on the left that are not familiar with the Peruvian history. As you know, I'm Peruvian American. I'm very familiar with history there. I lived there for a time. I have contacts there still. Another misconception is that the Peruvian army is with Dina Boluarte, who's the dictator. That's also false. So you have to understand the history. So it goes back to the first foreign minister of Pedro Castillo and his first compromise, because he made several changes of cabinets after that, appeasing the oligarchs or the ones ruled by the oligarchic forces, the right wing.
Sure.
And it's not because he sold out. That's another thing. That's another misconception. So let me explain the laws and why he had to do what he had to do and how unfair they were with Pedro Castillo from the beginning. Get into the foreign minister, get into the history of the army and what their actual position is, because it's complex. But I'm going to summarize it and make it as clear as possible.
Sure.
So, Peru is the only nation in Latin America. Well, first off, Peru is the easiest. The Congress has more power than any other Congress in all of Latin America. So it's easier for any other Congress in Latin America to overthrow. I mean, to impeach a president. They make it extremely easy to do so.
Gotcha.
All you need is 60%.
Yeah.
So they call it to vacate, where they have to leave immediately. So, for example, if the majority of the Congress and the Senate in the United States vote to impeach a president, the president still doesn't have to go. But in Peru, all you need is 60% of the Congress, a very, very low figure if you compare it to other countries, including ours. And the president has to immediately leave office. And so because of the coalition of right-wingers run by Fujimori and others, the daughter of former dictator Alberto Fujimori,
yep.
They have a lot of power in Congress. And so from day one, Pedro Castillo was under the gun. So a lot of people from the United States that don't know their laws in Peru say, oh, he's a sellout. He's changing cabinet to appeal to these right wingers in Congress. Why is he doing that? He's doing that because literally the next day they can vote him out. So they have to. He had to appease them from day one.
Yeah.
And so one of the first things he did was, he is a leftist. That's indisputable, and he's incorruptible. He's actually similar to Alex Saab if you think about it. So Pedro Castillo is incorruptible because he's not part of the Peruvian establishment. He was never a politician. He was a union leader, but he was never a politician. He was a school teacher. So because he was not part of the corrupt government in Lima, he was from Cajamarca in the countryside, where there's a large indigenous population. My grandmother was from there. So because he's a school teacher from Cajamarca, the Peruvian elites, largely white, largely Spanish descent, look down on him. And they've tried to sabotage him from day one because they know he's a leftist.
Yeah.
And so it's important to understand his first foreign minister was Hector Bejar. So Hector Bejar, this is how important Hector Bejar is. Hector Bejar literally formed, he was the founder of the guerrilla group that assisted Che in Bolivia.
Yeah.
There was a number of Peruvian comrades that died alongside Che, and those were his guerrillas that he recruited, Hector Bejar's. Yeah. And the only reason why Hector Bejar himself didn't go to Bolivia to assist Che in the late 1960s was because he was captured by the right-wing military government at the time and was prevented from going to Bolivia.
Sure.
Now, later in the late 60s, you had a leftist rise up in the Peruvian army named Velasco. He was the president even into the 70s during the Condor years when the fascist regimes were rising up. So at one point, Peru was the only nation in South America that wasn't run by a far-right government, and they were actually taking in refugees from Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia and other nations that were fleeing the right-wing governments. Velasco was protecting them. Velasco was a great leader. And so Velasco immediately gave a pardon to Hector Bejar and actually hired Hector Bejar to be part of his government to assist him in the agrarian reform. My father was in his 20s at this time, so he lived in Peru and he saw how Lima progressed under Velasco. My father and my grandfather were admirers of Velasco and the things that he did. They lived through it. They witnessed it. For example, before that, there was only 5 families that controlled most of the land in Lima. And because of the agrarian reform of Velasco, with the support of Hector Bejar and the other leftists, they were able to open things up for the indigenous people to get their land back. And so Hector came from that tradition. Pedro came from that tradition. And so he gave up his foreign minister. I was very frustrated at the time, but then I studied more and I learned these Peruvian laws that exist, which force, they have to change these laws. They're insane, but they have to, they force Pedro to have to make these compromises. And so there is still a large section of the Peruvian army back from the time of Velasco that are leftists. And I'll give you an example. There was a woman in an image. Actually, I know the person who filmed it. Her name's Camila. I met her. She works for Telesur. I met her in Venezuela. So there was a woman, a journalist, that was filming indigenous women resisting helicopter gunships in a region of Peru called Apurimac. And this image, I use it in my blog. It's an iconic image. It makes me think of the David, the Palestinian child with a slingshot against the Israeli tank supplied by the United States. So the U.S. helicopter gunship that the Lina Boluarte regime was using to massacre indigenous people, you really have a scene where an indigenous woman has a slingshot against a helicopter gunship. So the Peruvian military in Arequipa, which is the third largest city in Peru, in the south of Peru, were so moved by this, because even though it was covered up by the so-called Peruvian mainstream, it came out on social media. And the military in Arequipa was so moved by that image before she was killed shooting that slingshot, that they sided with the protesters. And there's been commanders in the Peruvian military that have come out and said, we come from the tradition of Velasco. We support the return of Pedro Castillo. We want there to be elections. And also, interestingly enough, Peru has the most unpopular Congress in all of Latin America. I've heard figures as high as 93%.
Mm-hmm.
93% of the Peruvian people oppose the Congress. So, of course, when he's using the Constitution, not overstepping his authority, when he's using Article 134 of the Peruvian Constitution to call for new elections of Congress,
yep,
he's acting within the Constitution, and he's being backed by the majority of the Peruvian people,
yeah,
largely indigenous or mestizo.
But for some reason, his vice president decided to side with the Nazis.
That's also inaccurate. So, Lina Boluarte was not his vice.
No.
So, no, not at the time that he was deposed. So let me explain. Pedro Castillo had several vice presidents.
Okay.
And many of them, again, the government very unstable in the year and a half he was in power, because he had to always make compromises with the Congress not to get ousted. Even to leave the country, by the way, he needed permission from Congress. The Congress is basically a dictatorship. The amount of power that they have is incredible.
Sure.
They denied him to go to Petro's inauguration in Colombia.
I remember
they denied him to go to Europe on a very important mission that would have been beneficial to the Peruvian economy. Just out of capriciousness and to try to sabotage him and make him look like a lame duck, they denied him being able to leave the country. He left on some missions, but there was instances where he was denied that. That's the power of Congress. No other Congress in the world, I believe, has that much power like in Peru. It's insane. Where was I going with this? Basically,
Boluarte is not wasn't his vice president.
Oh, yes. So one of the vice presidents he picked was a right winger to compromise with the Congress.
Sure.
He was only in power a short time and then thrown out of the party for being so right wing.
Yeah.
What was Lina Boluarte? About a year ago, she was vice president for a few weeks.
Huh.
So they found his most reactionary, most willing to sell out former VP, and they put her in.
So basically, she was never a good socialist, even though she was a member of the coalition that backed him.
Right. And so she's admitted that she doesn't believe in the ideas of the Peru Libre Party or the Free Peru Party, which is the party of the leftists of Pedro Castillo.
Well, yeah. Well, what's hilarious is that she's a member, or was a member, you said she got thrown out, of one of the biggest parties in the coalition that elected him. So it's kind of, that's some serious negotiation.
Yeah, but she's also under a lot of pressure from the left because of the massacres. So she's actually started to change her tune recently. And she said, like Vladimir Cerrone and other powerful ministers that were part of Pedro Castillo's government, they come out against her, including a congressman who I met in Venezuela, Alex Flores. He's the leader of Ayacucho, which is one of the main epicenters of the rebellion against her. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, she came out recently and said, yo soy de izquierdas, pero no soy de la izquierda radical. So she was saying, I'm from the left, I'm just not part of the radical left. But that's not what she said before. Before, she said she didn't believe in the progressive ideas of the Peru Libre Party.
And I mean, how much of the left can she be from if she's killing protesters for the right wing?
And she's mestiza, so she has some indigenous blood. There's a lot of racist mestizas, by the way.
Oh no, I know.
But she's more Spaniard than anything, probably.
Are you familiar with the scandal on the Los Angeles City Council?
Well, let me before we get into that, let me stress this point. It's an important point. She come out recently. She came out recently in a video, and I understand Spanish. I don't understand Quechua. Quechua is the language of the Incas,
Sure.
and in very broken Quechua mixed in with Spanish words that I understood. She tried to talk to the indigenous women in Apurimac and the other indigenous people that are resisting her, saying stupid things like why are you against me? I'm a woman, using identity politics basically, Peruvian style, which is not very convincing to them. But yeah, so she's been under pressure from the left and from indigenous groups, and she's been trying to change her tune. It doesn't matter. Her actions was matters. She's done war crimes, just
Yeah.
like Janine Añez did in Bolivia. Now she's
And
in
what's more,
and
and
she's trying
what's
to flee
more,
to
she
Brazil.
betrayed her own party and her own president.
Now, from the LA City Council, I heard a recording of a conversation between,
Yep.
I don't know if it's the same story, but I heard a recording of a Latina woman,
Nuri Martinez, who was the president
Speaking
of the
with-
city council,
speaking with other
Kevin De Leon.
Latino council members and talking like as if the adopted child of a man who was African American kid was a monkey or something like that.
Yeah, it's pretty. They said some awful things, but
Yeah,
basically,
but what I'm talking about is mestizo or mestiza people, and for
Yes.
those that don't know, that's if you have Spanish and indigenous blood that are racist against indigenous people, even though they're part of this themselves, or they're at least more proud
well,
of their Spanish heritage.
Well, there has been a long time project by Mexican Americans of mostly mestiza descent during the Jim Crow era to make sure that they were recognized as white.
Right. So let me get back into Peru because I want to stress a couple important
Sure.
historical points because also
Yes.
doesn't get into the history. Besides Hector Bejar, who is still alive and was important for former guerrilla and a member of Velasco's government. Cajamarca, where Pedro Castillo's from, was the site of the first massacre of Inca people.
Mm-hmm.
It's where the Spaniards captured the last Inca ruler, Atahualpa, and they killed hundreds of his defenders in the process of capturing him. And actually, unlike in Cusco, where you have several Inca structures left, there's only one Inca structure left in all of Cajamarca. It's because the Spaniards were so proud of where they captured and executed Atahualpa. So in the chambers where he was held, where he filled the rooms of silver and gold, sent runners to the three quarters of the Inca kingdom, to the far quarters of the Inca kingdom, to collect the silver and gold because he was smart. He learned how to play chess. He used to play chess with Hernan de Soto, who he made friends with. Hernan de Soto left, and that's when they killed them. But he learned how to play chess. He found out how the Spaniards loved silver and gold because he didn't consider it as wealth. He considered it as part of the Inca religion. The Inti sun god, who's the brother of the moon goddess.
Yeah.
The gold represents the sweat of the sun, and the silver represents the tears of the moon. So they see them as ceremonial objects, not as wealth. But Atahualpa, who didn't speak Spanish, obviously, but was a very smart ruler, noticed how the Spaniards were enticed by silver and gold, and so he said, "If you free me, I'll fill these chambers up with silver and gold." He kept his word, and then they made up a story that they were going to try to come rescue him, and they executed him. And so that happened in Cajamarca. So that has a very important historical significance to the Inca people. And also Ayacucho that I mentioned earlier. Ayacucho was the last decisive battle of the Spanish Empire in South America. And it was fought by Bolivar's right-hand man, Sucre.
Yeah.
And actually, Bolivar, when his wife died, who ironically was from Spain, he made a promise he would never remarry. But basically, she was like his wife. She was from Ecuador.
Yeah.
What was her name? Manuela Sanz. Manuela Sanz was a leader in one of the divisions that fought Ayacucho. There was women that fought. There was indigenous women that fought. But it was the last major battle. That's how important Ayacucho is. And they have a university there. And so they have a history of rebellion against imperialism. So Ayacucho is resisting, Cajamarca is resisting, Arequipa, I mentioned earlier, is resisting, and Cusco itself. For example, there was thousands of tourists in Machu Picchu outside of Cusco that had to be evacuated by helicopter. Usually you go there either by the Inca Trail where you have to go on foot. You have to be very
Yeah.
quick for that high in the mountains, or you go by train. Most people go by train. So the rail workers were on strike, demanding the return of Pedro Castillo, and because of that, they had to send the Belarte regime had to send several helicopters to rescue the tourists from there. And there was a lot of people that were more outraged by some inconvenienced tourists than the fact that indigenous people are being massacred in Apurimac. That all they have to fight with is slingshots, for God's sakes. That shows where their priorities lie, right?
Well, I mean, obviously, when you're talking about any country in Latin America, anything that inconveniences Americans or Europeans is the biggest deal there is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at least as far as the U.S. media goes.
So somebody asked about the Shining Path. Hector Bejar once said the Shining Path were CIA, and I tend to agree with him. The Shining Path killed more indigenous people than any other group that they attacked. And I'm not saying they were CIA agents, but they certainly got CIA support, I'm sure.
Well,
because the Shining Path were used as a way for Fujimori to justify his authoritarianism.
I'm very, very skeptical about because one of the things about the Dirty War is that there was a whole lot of lying going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to admit that I am very skeptical. For instance, during this most recent election, there was an attack on a bar in a little town during the election, before Castillo won.
Mm-hmm.
And the attack was made allegedly by Peruvian revolutionary communists, who are what's left of the Shining Path, who were supposedly killing poor people at a bar.
Well, but basically the Ronderos, who are the campesinos or the peasants that Pedro Castillo represented in Ayacucho, they emerged. I'm sorry, in Cajamarca, they emerged as a leftist group against the Shining Path.
Sure.
So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some remnants of the Shining Path in the Peruvian jungle that went to the coast. This happened in Lima, right?
No, this was the attack didn't happen in Lima. The attack was in a town somewhere out in the boonies.
Yeah, it was probably out in the jungle, because they say there's still a few remnants of the Shining Path there. But yeah, the Shining Path don't like Pedro Castillo, and the Shining Path, by most of the Peruvian leftists, are considered basically tools of the CIA.
And they're anti-electoral anyway. But the attack and the way that the government was framing the people who were killed were the sort of people a government death squad would kill.
Right.
And it was the sort of town that a death squad would attack. And the idea I got from that specific attack was, this kind of looks like a false flag to blame a communist group while a socialist is running for president.
And I wouldn't necessarily blame the Peruvian military for that. Again, there's
not necessarily the military.
Yeah, the military is a mixed bag, but there are still significant amount of commanders that back Pedro Castillo. And I can tell you from the inside, from my contacts, that the Congress went first to the Peruvian military and demanded a coup, and they refused because of the amount of generals and commanders that were like, no, we like Pedro Castillo, we want him to stay, or this is going to destabilize the country. And so instead of going that route, they did the parliamentary coup.
And I've always wondered how much during the Dirty War, I've always wondered how much of the Western media was just blaming the Shining Path for everything that happened in Peru.
Right. And so there was also the Tupac Amaru guerrillas, who were kind of more legitimate guerrillas, but the Shining Path claimed to be Maoists, but they were led by a guy who's Spanish descent, a white Peruvian, an academic, who used indigenous people to kill other indigenous people, basically.
Oh, sure.
And they also went after Fujimori and the government, but I wouldn't be surprised if Fujimori infiltrated them with the Americans to justify authoritarian rule. And the same could be said of the FARC, right? There's a lot of good people that entered the FARC. I'm not trying to say otherwise. And also their hands were forced, because when the FARC had made an agreement with the government in Colombia in the past, the militaries were able to keep their weapons, and they went to their homes and they massacred them, and then they were forced to return to the mountains and rise up again. Yep. But there has been infiltration and drug cartels in the FARC. And they've kidnapped leftists. Like they kidnapped Ingrid Betancourt. She was trying to negotiate with them. She's at least a progressive. And so that's not what Che and the guerrillas and Hector Berra were about, kidnapping people. So these people, a lot of them are fake, you know.
Well, I mean, there's always going to be fake people in any group like that, because
even Hugo Chavez had captured a FARC member that entered Venezuelan territory and sent him back to Colombia because they had good relations with Santos at the time.
There are always people who join revolutionary groups because they want power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just look at some of the people who have associated themselves with the American left in various ways, but who are speaking.
The Subcomandante Marcos, the Zapatistas, they never kidnapped anybody.
Exactly.
You could accuse them of being too sectarian, but you can't say that they're infiltrated or they're corrupt. Like some of these other guerrilla groups.
Even if you try, I mean, if you accuse them of, it's hard to accuse them of being too sectarian because because their ideology isn't really any one thing. They're a very successul combination.
So what I mean by sectarian is that AMLO begs every day of them in communiques, you know, to join him, and they won't. They get petitions all the time from Mexican leftist groups, large groups who want to help them. And they don't want to cooperate with any of them. They like to do their own little sect.
Well, but their whole thing is autonomy.
But let me make the point. They did in the 90s when they were under attack during NAFTA.
Yeah.
Respond to those groups finally that were always offering them help because they needed them. They were under attack.
Yeah.
But as soon as there was an agreement reached and they were left alone in Chiapas, they didn't want to work with those groups anymore.
Well,
so that's what I mean by sectarian. I don't mean sectarian like an ideology. Because some people say they're anarchists and socialists. They don't really define that. They're kind of communitarian. So I don't mean sectarian in that sense. I mean sectarian in the sense that they don't want to work with other groups, even if it's very beneficial to them.
Because they're primarily concerned with making sure their corner of the world is safe for their people.
Right. But I'm not going to say that they're corrupt at all. No.
Oh,
these other guerrilla groups have been corrupted, unfortunately. Yeah.
They have a rule that I wish more of our groups had, which is you have to learn from the people, which is if you want to be a leader, you have to go live with poor folks for a while and learn what it's like to be poor.
I mean, Zapata himself was like that, right? Zapata was mestizo, but he was very proud of his indigenous roots and he wanted to be with the people.
Yes. And his movement was very pro-indigenous, much more so than the northern rebels.
You know, Pancho Villa wrote a letter. I don't think it was ever able to be delivered. They found the letter, but he wrote a letter that he was trying to send to Zapata where he proposed that they work together to invade the United States.
That
would have been badass.
That's the wrong direction, but I guess why he would. I can see why he would say so.
Well, he was pissed at the Americans because Pancho Villa was in the north of Mexico, and the Americans were backing his rivals.
Well,
so
originally,
extra forces from the south to help him take care of the Americans.
I'll have to study some of that a little bit more. I know that Pancho Villa robbed a bank in the U.S. to pay for his operations when funding started to dry up, because his co-commander, who was supposed to be his partner, stayed loyal to I hate it when I can't talk right. Stayed loyal to Carranza, and eventually ended up becoming president after Villa and Carranza were both gone.
Wouldn't that be cool if Villa joined up with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and went down to Bolivia and robbed some banks down there?
Well, you know, unlike Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, they have all those pictures of Villa after he got shot.
Oh man!
You know, at one point the car he got shot up in was in a casino in Vegas until they sent it back to Mexico.
Well, I hope that Chile returns the leg of a Peruvian war hero in the War of the Pacific. Like the only part of his body that remained was his leg, and they put it into a museum in Chile.
How rude!
But no, actually, I think it's the opposite. It says, it's the Huáscar. So his boat was captured by the Chileans and brought back to Chile, but the Peruvians were able to recover Miguel Grau's leg and bury it back in Peru. I met his granddaughter. But yeah, Grau. It's interesting. The war in the Pacific, where Bolivia lost its coast because Bolivia was an ally of Peru,
Yeah.
was a war where Chile had a right wing government that was backed by the Europeans. The United States had no role there; they weren't an empire yet. But they had the minerals in Antofagasta in the region of western Bolivia and southern Peru at the time. The Chileans wanted access to that land, so the
Yeah.
Europeans helped them. They had superior arms, and they invaded a lot of the the entire Bolivian coast, and they invaded much of the Peruvian coast. Uh, and so, yeah, that was called the War of the
War of the
Pacific,
Pacific. Yeah.
and it was a war instigated by Chile. They were the aggressors, and they were very
Yeah.
brutal. They would like shoot Peruvian sailors in the water and take no prisoners. And there's a statute, for example, to Miguel Grau, the Peruvian general in Miami, and it says "Hero of Human Rights." Why was he hero of human rights, even though he was a military leader? Because he was known to be a gentleman, and any prisoners of war or sailors on the other side, on the Chilean side, that he was able to grab, he was able to take and return to the Chileans. So he was known to go out of his way to respect the human rights of the enemy, and he was very brave. He had a chance to leave the battle in the Huáscar, but he held out till the end, and in the end, they captured his boat and they blew him to pieces. But yeah, Bolivia's always tried to get their coast back. There was even negotiations between Allende before he was taken out. Well, he ended up killing himself before the coup in Chile. Well, do you know they proved that with an autopsy like decades later?
Oh yeah.
They unearthed Allende's body and they proved he shot himself. And I'm not surprised because I read his final address on the radio, and it sounded like he was saying goodbye. He was going to either go down fighting or take himself out.
I don't know. I don't like letting the CIA off the hook.
Yeah, so I mean, he knew what would have happened if he stayed alive.
Sure.
And didn't go down fighting. Like they would have tortured him.
Oh, I'm sure.
There was so many people that were tortured after that by the Pinochet regime.
Pinochet,
a lot of the descendants of those who fled, I met. I mean, not a lot, but a few of them I met when I was in Venezuela. There was a Chilean Australian comrade whose family fled Pinochet. There was a Belgian Chilean comrade whose family fled Pinochet, and Pinochet's not Pinochet's Allende's grandson is a Chavista. He was born in Mexico. His family fled Pinochet, and he lived in Venezuela for several years. His name is Pablo Allende.
Yeah.
And Pablo Allende, one of my favorite quotes from him. I'm really disappointed I get to meet him when I was down there. I'd love to whenever I return. But one of my favorite Pablo Allende quotes is when he quotes his grandfather. Allende said in a speech in Mexico, actually, at a university there, a state university, he said, "To be young and not be revolutionary is a biological contradiction." And so Pablo Allende said, to be an Allendista and not be a Chavista is an ideological contradiction. But you see, this is covered up. For example, when I met Isabel Allende, right? When I met the niece of Salvador Allende, who's a famous writer now, she lives in California. She fled Pinochet too.
Mm-hmm.
She's the niece because her father was the first cousin of Allende.
Sure.
So she's technically his second cousin. But anyways, I met her in Miami at a book fair, and I asked her a question. And my question to her, I didn't mention Venezuela at all. I just asked her in the question, could you tell about your political influence of your grandfather? And she said something very stupid, where I lost some respect for her. I wanted to debate her, but I couldn't. It was one of those Q&As where you got to ask your question and then let it go on to the next person. But anyways, and this is no disrespect to her writer. She's a great writer. But she's just misinformed about Venezuela. So all I said to her is the influence of her grandfather. And, I mean, not her grandfather, I'm sorry. The influence of her uncle who was president of Chile. That's what I said.
Yeah.
And she said, I have family in Venezuela. No, she said, I'm on the left. I've always been on the left. But I have family in Venezuela, and I can't support Maduro or something like that. she knows quite well and knew at the time that the grandson of Allende is openly Chavista.
Yeah.
But they're covering that up. So there's other relatives that he has that live in Venezuela that are not. But yeah, that's kind of a hidden secret. Like a lot of people like to say Pinochet was bad and Allende was good, but Chavez is no Allende. I see Chavez, especially Chavez, not just Maduro, as direct legacy of that, because think about it. In 1973, only 25 years passed. In 1998, there was a leftist again in power in South America. That was Chavez. I see Chavez as the direct legacy of the people that were trying to, through the democratic route, acquire a more socialist or humanitarian system.
Yep, it's true, and they were definitely trying. And Chavez had opportunities to use his revolutionized military to try to take over the country and short circuit democracy, and wouldn't do it.
And by the way, Torrijos in Panama, who got rid of the U.S. bases, it was probably taken up by the CIA in the plane crash before Noriega took over. Ironically, it was the U.S. puppet until it became an enemy. But Torrijos was a leftist of the military in Panama.
Yeah.
And just like there was a leftist military leader in Bolivia after Che died, and also Chavez came from military background, and Velasco, who I mentioned earlier, who left power in the 70s, but was still in power at the beginning of the Condor years when the fascist regime was rising up in other parts of South America. And so people think military, people think police, and they think Venezuela, or other countries in Latin America, and they think it's just like the United States. It's not true at all.
Well,
the interactions between the military, police, and the civilian population, which I've witnessed firsthand in Venezuela, is completely different than here in the United States. The working class people and the people of color and the poor people of Venezuela, who are a lot of better conditions now under Chavez and Maduro than it was in the 90s under U.S. puppets, they feel relieved when they see the police or military police come, because they're protecting them from the white elite militias or lynch mobs that would come and attack them otherwise.
I can see that,
especially during elections, because they would bomb those voting booths if they had their way.
Sure.
So I felt very safe and protected by them when I was there as an observer, because they're working class police. They're representing the working class. They're representing the socialist government. They're not there representing the elite and the capitalists like in the United States. It's a different type of interaction.
Yes.
So when people are looking at it as an American-centric or North American-centric type of scope, they have to understand the history there is different. It's a different context.
Yes, that makes a difference.
And they even have a name for it. It's called La Unión Cívico-Militar. So that's roughly translated the union, but the civic military union. It's the union between the civilian population and the military or the military police, and how they're protected by them and they cooperate with one another. So it's not an authoritarian way. It's kind of a defensive way to defend them from right-wing mobs that would come in otherwise and try to take over those communities or stop them from voting or whatever they're trying to do.
Definitely. No, and I think that's important to understand that when you have a revolutionized military is very different from
and they have a people's militia. The people militia, the fishermen militia, were the ones that captured the American mercenaries soon after they crossed the border in from Colombia.
That's right.
So if there was a land invasion of Venezuela, like a full-scale land invasion of American troops, it would probably be something similar to Iran. Like you'd have to bring back the draft because of the size of the country and how many people
very
are
possible.
armed.
I can see that.
It would be very bloody.
That's why they don't want to actually invade.
Sanctions instead, the economic warfare, which is very cowardly. And it will cause a massive amount of death, according to the UN, over 100,000.
And it hurts the least powerful people in the country more than it hurts the people they claim to want to hurt.
And it gives more support to Maduro, to the government, the ruling government, than would have got otherwise.
They see the U.S. killing their people. No, I mean, I don't understand why people think we sanction a country and make poor people poorer and make their lives harder. Why they're somehow going to be on our side? That's just stupid. That was the garbage they were spewing before Iraq in 2001, where they said they'll greet us as liberators. How did that work out?
Yeah.
No, and I think a lot, and I really believe if you track down what's going on in Peru, you're going to find a U.S. ambassador somewhere or a CIA station chief somewhere up really close with somebody in the Peruvian Congress.
Well, I can't remember her name, but the Grey Zone did a good piece on the American ambassador to Peru, who's a woman, and they said that her Wikipedia doesn't state that she worked for the CIA, but she did work
You
for the
see,
CIA.
that's an important detail.
And she actually put it out there like almost immediately in a statement, the support for Dina taking over. So the U.S. was probably planning it because of how they reacted to it and all that.
Probably because they were ready to support the new president right away. And I don't hear anybody making the kind of...
Pedro Castillo's refused to resign, by the way. He's under the gun. He's in a prison.
Yeah,
he still refuses to sign any papers resigning.
Good for him.
Yeah, he's very brave. And then Chavez did something similar in 2002 when they tried to take him out. They wanted him to sign a resignation. He never did.
I haven't heard anyone speak up about what's happening in Peru the way they're speaking up about what's happening in Brazil.
Well, the thing is, there's a lot of Democrats that like Lula because they see Bolsonaro as a mini Trump.
But it's not definitely. But it's not even just quote unquote progressive Democrats. I mean, one of the people who was supporting Lula was Joaquin Castro.
Yeah, but what that's what I have to say. I was talking about progressive Democrats.
Yeah, I got you.
I'm talking about centrist Democrats that don't like Trump.
Yeah,
like Lula. And that's why you hear more of an outcry with the recent coup attempt in Brazil versus what happened in Peru.
Do they not know Lula was the one who put BRICS together and that the CIA got him arrested in the first place for that?
Also, people change, right? I'm a little bit skeptical of Lula, but I'm optimistic at the same time. Cautiously optimistic is the best way to put it.
So Lula,
let me give you an example though. Honduras.
Lula was never Hugo Chavez. I mean,
well, let me put it this way. Honduras. Okay, let me give the Honduras case as an example. So obviously, Manuel Zelaya was ousted by the Obama regime. I mean, the CIA, but Obama was the president at the time.
Yeah.
In Honduras, causing a lot of the chaos there. So who's in power in Honduras now? They were elected recently, like within a few days of me leaving Venezuela. They had elections in Honduras. Is Xiomara Castro de Zelaya, the wife of Manuel Zelaya.
Huh.
And what's one of the first things she did? She made a deal with the United States for them to capture and extradite to the United States the main opposition figure who ran against her. So it's like, why is she trusting the Americans who ousted her husband a few years ago?
That does seem a little... Well, but you can ask the same question. Why do the Kurds keep trusting America in the Middle East?
Well, let me bring it back to Lula. And that's a good analogy, by the way, of the Kurds. I get that too. But Lula, what was his reaction to the coup in Peru? Did you read his reaction to it?
I did not.
He was completely wrong.
Well, that doesn't surprise me.
Well, let me tell you the amount of countries that were right. Venezuela was the first country to denounce the coup. Soon after, there was a joint statement of Argentina, Bolivia, Mexico, and Colombia. And Dina felt so, the dictator of Peru, Dina Boluarte, felt so threatened by this that she expelled their ambassadors. And so there are several left Latin American countries who had good relations with Pedro Castillo. Petro, for example, Colombia was very upset, and Petro is very brave. He's gone to Venezuela a couple of times now to negotiate with Maduro. Petro was very upset that Pedro Castillo could not go to celebrate his victory. Yeah. It's not because he didn't want to. Again, the Peruvian Congress blocked him.
Exactly.
That's how capricious they are. And that's how much power they have. Way too much power. There are several countries in Latin America that had the right position on Peru. Lula did not. Lula said that Dina Boluarte's coup was legal. He didn't say much about it, but he did say that to justify it. So that could have been him signaling to his vice president, who's a right winger, or to be fair, his vice president center right. But that could have been the PT, right, the Partido Trabajador, or the Workers' Party that Lula represents. There's a center there.
Yeah,
similar to the Kirchneristas in Argentina, or the center Peronists that run Argentina now. For example, the president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, who's not related to Cristina Fernandez. Cristina Fernandez is a Kirchner. She's the vice president. She's more left, but she doesn't have a lot of power, and they've been going after her. But I would say Alberto Fernandez is center, but he's had bad relations with Venezuela too, although he recently reestablished diplomatic relations with them. So Brazil, Lula's position, which is completely wrong on Peru, could be him signaling to the center of the PT party, or also signaling he wants to have better relations with the United States.
Well, it's
that's why I'm cautiously optimistic about Lula. He is having good relations with Venezuela, but it's complicated.
I'll be totally honest. There were some things that people didn't like. There's some people there. I could come up with complaints about AMLO and things he's done to help the U.S. on the border.
I think AMLO's to the left of Lula.
Yes, but that's the thing. Even AMLO has to cooperate with the U.S. in some areas because the U.S. is on his border.
Well, because of treaty obligations as well.
That too. But because of treaty obligations with the U.S., AMLO has to enforce the agreements with the Trump and Biden State Departments to try to stop people from getting into the U.S. from Mexico.
And even though AMLO's offered asylum to Assange, there was an activist, I'm trying to remember his name right now, Commander X. Have you heard of Commander X?
Sounds familiar.
So Commander X, I think he was a leader in Anonymous, and he fled to Mexico. There was trumped up charges against him in the United States, at least from what I understood of his case. And so he was given asylum in Mexico, but he was not given asylum by AMLO. He was given asylum by the president before AMLO.
Sure.
But in the beginning, AMLO permitted him to stay there, and then he ended up deporting him to the United States. So that drew my suspicion. But maybe he just didn't understand who Commander X was, because Commander X is not known like Assange is. But AMLO's done a lot of other great things. I mean, he literally saved Evo Morales' life during the coup there.
Mm-hmm. I remember that.
Yeah, he's offered asylum to Assange. He's hosted the dialogue between the Venezuelan opposition and Maduro's government, which is
he hosted the anti. What was it? The anti OAS meeting to sort of shadow the OAS meeting.
I mean, even people that have written against Alex Saab have exposed the head of OAS, Almagro, for being corrupt.
Yeah,
not just for his corrupt positions in Bolivia,
well, the OAS has always been a CIA,
but like he's been involved in like bribing schemes, Almagro. And Pedro Castillo, they said, was naive to meet with Almagro, and Almagro kind of stabbed him in the back. I think that's the most you can possibly accuse Pedro Castillo of being, because he wasn't part of the political system. He was a little bit naive. But I refuse to believe he's corrupt. And I refuse to believe he overstepped, because he used a law that's in the Peruvian Constitution to call for a new election, which would have restored democracy, not the opposite.
That's the whole thing. Yeah,
the majority of the people were against what the Congress was doing. They were just trying to obstruct everything he was trying to do.
Exactly. The Congress isn't with the people who elected me. I'm not with the people who elected the Congress. Let the voters decide. Let's have a new Congress.
And so people that call it a dissolving of Congress, that's incorrect. It's a revote. He wanted there to be a revote.
It's like because the president there is the head of state, and the president there has the same sort of interactions with the legislature that the King of England has, so to speak. It's the similar position, as opposed to the relationship between a U.S. president and the legislature.
Well, you have a point, because the British monarchs have limited power. But I'll put it this way: the Peruvian Congress has way too much power. I mean, can you name me a country in the world where the president has to ask permission from his Congress to travel abroad?
What I mean in this constitutional setup is, the King of England, under the laws of the British Constitution, though there's no written British Constitution, they talk about the British Constitution all the time.
Magna Carta, isn't it?
Well, the British Constitution is an imaginary collection of ideas from all the British documents you've heard of. So the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights from the Glorious Revolution and stuff. And so the British Constitution is basically all these sets of different founding documents woven together in the imagination of British lawyers.
Right.
And so when they talk about the Constitution, they're really talking about what we would call common law. But they call it the Constitution. And under the British Constitution, the monarch is officially, the prime minister does it now in the monarch's name. But the monarch is officially the one who dissolves or prorogues parliament and calls for elections. Now, the way it works now is if the prime minister tells the monarch to do it, the monarch doesn't have much choice. But that used to be the monarch's one real power to say, okay, time for a new election. The people don't believe in the government.
And so, anyways, in case you didn't know, Chris, they're saying that they want to hold Pedro Castillo for a year and a half without bringing a conviction. Like, they won't even start to try to convict him in court for another year and a half.
It's ridiculous.
We won't have elections in Peru for another year and a half, even though the people every day are rising up and calling for elections right away.
Yeah, it sounds like they're the ones trying to short circuit democracy because they don't want to have to stand for re-election right now.
Right. And so I am still optimistic that things will change in Latin America, continue to change for good. But I think that's important that Peru goes left again. Dina Boluarte is not some progressive former vice president. She's a vice president for a short amount of time in Pedro's party that he picked to accommodate the right.
Yeah,
because he had no choice. He was under the gun.
And who clearly stabbed him in the back.
I mean, even Pinochet, Allende thought was a loyal general.
Oh, I'm sure.
There's footage of Pinochet and Fidel Castro together. Do you know that? When Fidel Castro visited Allende in Chile, he was like his number 2 general, Allende's number 2 general. And I guess his politics were not very known. They just assumed he was a loyal general to Allende. And they have a footage of Fidel in like this military parade and Fidel next to Pinochet having a conversation with him.
Most of those right-wing generals didn't give public speeches opposing their governments. They talked quietly to the CIA.
They plotted. They plot amongst themselves and with the
Guatemala. In Guatemala, the generals actually supported the government. It was a bunch of colonels who conspired with the CIA to throw
Arbenz
out, yes. And the new junta was a bunch of colonels who got rid of all the generals and made themselves the highest ranking people in the army, basically.
So what was the coup? The one coup that Che witnessed, because what happened in Cuba was not a coup; it was a revolution. The one coup that Che was witness to was in Guatemala. It was a doctor who was sympathetic to Arbenz, who was trying to work within his government, and so that's convinced Che that he needed to stay in that part of Latin America, and he knew that the U.S. imperialists backed the coup against Arbenz, and so that's why he was. When he went on to Mexico, he could have went back to Argentina. He went on to Mexico, met the Castro brothers. He was very sympathetic to them from the get-go because he already started getting political education, but also he witnessed, because Castro was aware the U.S. was going to try to intervene in Cuba against him. And so Che saw Castro like another Arbenz, and so that was like the precursor to him joining up with the Cuban revolutionaries.
Here's where we're going to stop, because this is always the nice place to end when we're talking about Castro. Imagine how much worse history would have been if Fidel Castro had been able to throw a fastball and had made it to the majors. Because if Fidel Castro had a major league fastball,
you mean the United States, right?
What?
You mean in the United States when he tried to play baseball in the United States?
He was in the Washington Senators farm system. He wanted to pitch. His dream was to pitch for the Washington Senators. Why the Senators, I don't know. I guess he was a Walter Johnson fan.
Yeah, but he was also a brilliant lawyer. He wasn't just into sports.
And Walter Johnson was kind of a pro-labor sort of commie guy, so it makes sense. Walter Johnson was from Kansas when Kansas was still socialist. But yeah, he wanted to play for the Senators, which is kind of a funny dream because the Senators were not ever a hugely successful franchise. They won.
By the way, Fidel worked with the Nationalist Orthodox Party for a while, who were not socialists. His younger brother Raul was a socialist, but Fidel did not become a socialist till later on. But he was always
Raul
interested in politics and the law, not just sports.
No, I know, but I mean,
Yeah.
he really wanted to play for the Senators. And if
He also admired certain leaders in American history. They say he
I
admired
know.
Abraham Lincoln and all that.
Well, I mean, and that was the same thing. I mean, Ho Chi Minh was the same way.
Yeah.
Ho Chi Minh admired Abraham Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. And Ho Chi Minh, this is a history that is not told enough. Ho Chi Minh was the most important American ally in Southeast Asia during World War II.
And Indochina, absolutely.
Single-handedly.
The OSS worked with him. That's a precursor to CIA to expel the Japanese.
There were people who were telling Truman that they needed to let Ho Chi Minh run the country. He was someone they could work with. And Truman wouldn't listen.
Well, Truman, who formed the CIA, later regretted it. He wrote in an op-ed within days of Kennedy's assassination that he was worried that the CIA was turning into the American Gestapo. Did he have inside knowledge and consider that the CIA had taken out Kennedy? Who knows?
Well, the thing to remember is that there were two groups in the OSS. There were the people who eventually went on to start the CIA, and there were Donovan's boys. And Wild Bill Donovan, kind of liked communists. Wild Bill Donovan had socialist friends and communist friends, and the Donovan boys wrote a manual for the OSS saying that the absolute best people to work with in German-occupied countries were communists.
Because a lot of the fighting was done by partisans.
Yes.
Who were made up of anarchists, socialists, and communists.
The Italian partisans were all either anarchists or members of the groups that went on to start the Red Brigades during the Cold War.
Correct.
The French underground.
Tito was a partisan, by the way, in Yugoslavia.
Yes, a Yugoslavian partisan. The French underground during World War II were socialists and communists who hated Pétain because he was right-wing and didn't like seeing so many French soldiers go to fight the Russians in the German army.
What about the Greek partisans? The Greek partisans were leftists too, no?
The Greek partisans were also communists, yes. And the two groups who were working with the United States in the German underground were the Red Orchestra and the Black Orchestra. The Red Orchestra were communists, and the Black Orchestra were anarchists who had connections in the German military. And these were the two groups that did the most legwork for the OSS during World War II, the Red Orchestra and the Black Orchestra.
So anyways, those that want to know where, that are not familiar with me because I haven't been on your show in a while, where they can find me, I'm not on Facebook, but I am on Twitter. You see here my Twitter handle, Al Suarez 2. And I'm going to be putting up hopefully the Portuguese version of my book. It'll be translated to Portuguese as well, The Diplomat. I'd love people in Brazil to read it on the Alex Saab case and know more about Alex Saab. I'd like to see more leaders speak out about Alex Saab. He is originally from Colombia. It would be nice to see Petro speak out on his behalf. AMLO, I believe, has talked about Alex Saab because he's hosted the dialogue, and Alex Saab was supposed to be one of the mediators of that dialogue. Yeah. So hopefully more leaders speak out on him and condemn Judge Scola and how he's put international diplomacy and world peace at risk. I mean, they had for years a world poll of who was the biggest threat to world peace, and the United States was always number one. Of course. They've had recent polls now asking who is the biggest preventer of democracy. You could say preventer of human rights as well, right? But the preventer of democracy, and the United States came out as number one as well. So the world knows what's going on. The world knows that the U.S. is an empire. It's a question of convincing our own people and making that change.
So there are two things going on right now as far as the international right goes. Prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a lot of unity between the international far right. The the Christian fundamentalists in the U.S. and the Russian fundamentalists in Russia were all giving money to the same political groups in both countries. And for that matter, that's why you still see the Republicans stand up for Russia now. It's not.
By the way, the sanctions against major nations like Russia don't hurt Russia. They actually benefited Russia in some way.
Some ways. But yeah, no, being enemies with the U.S. is great for Russia in the global South, because countries that are having trouble with the U.S. can do business with Russia, and Russia gets to look like the good guy. I'm not a Putin supporter. I don't think Putin in the end is good for Russia. I would love to see a working class revolution in Russia, but their left is a little.
But there's also a right wing and a Stalinist opposition against Putin. So some of the people that are competing with him for power would be even worse.
Well,
so
and
I'm not saying there's not leftists in Russia. I'm just saying that a lot of them are very disorganized.
Oh, I agree.
But yeah, great coming back on, man.
And the communist,
great talking with everybody here.
Party faced a bolt by a bunch of the more Stalinist members of the Communist Party have weird relationships with right wingers.
Well, yeah, it wasn't Caleb like associated with one of those groups. Caleb Maupin.
Was that?
Wasn't Caleb Maupin associated with one of those groups?
Yes, Caleb Maupin is a Duganista, Alexander Dugin disciple.
Was that the one whose daughter was assassinated when they tried to kill him?
They killed his daughter instead. Yeah,
that's unfortunate.
Dugin. Well, his daughter was a political figure with much of the same.
Yeah, no, she was.
I'm not trying to say that she was an adult who believes most of the things her father does. So I mean, I'm not ever happy anyone gets killed, but it's not the kind of horrible tragedy of an innocent person being blown up that people tried to make it sound like. But I mean,
political assassinations, even Che in guerrilla warfare. Che in guerrilla warfare said never kidnap, never do political assassination or political terrorism. And he actually said it's not because of morals, because he didn't believe in bourgeois morals, or at least the morals that would be considered in the bourgeois standards. He said it's because it's going to demoralize your base and it's going to make you lose support.
Exactly.
Do acts like that. So yeah, I mean, one thing is when you're at war, but exposing your enemies could be good too. But turning them into martyrs, political assassination.
Well, and that's the big thing.
And that's what happened with Che. With Che, after he was assassinated, his figure became so much more powerful as well.
Yes, and I would never say that there's not a place for that. That kind of targeted violence worked very well for the African National Congress when they were fighting apartheid.
But I'm saying, in principle, it doesn't usually work, and it emboldens your enemy against you,
unless you're able to propagandize about your targets. Mm-hmm. See, the reason it worked in South Africa is because when you kill a corrupt racist judge who's sentenced a lot of black people to death or prison, it's really hard to make him a martyr to black people.
Well, yeah, I mean, China, for example, I support the death penalty in non-imperialist countries. So I don't. So China. Let me get the point why I'm saying this though. In China, for example, there's been corrupt bankers, that have been executed, and here, of course, they're given a promotion when they do that, but. So I think in a country where they're trying to make a more socialist system, where you have corrupt people, if you have zero tolerance, where there's severe punishment or even executions, that could possibly be a good thing. But in imperialist countries that are racist and that are classist, it's not fair, because you see most people on death row are people of color or working class or poor people.
My personal opinion, and this is my personal opinion, I don't know how deeply ideological it is. I don't think I would necessarily 100% feel this way, but my personal opinion, generally speaking, is that the state should not kill people. And the reason the state should not kill people is because and this is going to sound silly, there are times when certain people might need to be killed. But in those situations, the decision should be made by people most harmed by them and not by the state itself.
So they shouldn't be extrajudicial or judicial killings. They should be taken out by the people that were wronged.
Well, so there was an episode of Boston Legal where James Spader essentially argued for revenge killings, which is interesting. But basically he's saying that if someone commits a crime of revenge against someone who is definitely guilty of what is being revenged, then they have a moral argument for their justification that should be listened to.
Well, that happened.
But
There was a brother who was exonerated by a jury who admitted to killing his sister's killer, but because of the sympathy of the jurors, he got away with it.
Yes, and jury nullification. And I believe that there are certain situations where, there might be a situation where a jury should let someone off the hook. Now, that does, at the same time, the fact that I believe that there are certain situations where killing someone is justified and necessary, that doesn't change the fact that I don't want the state to do it. The state should not be killing its citizens.
What if the state is the workers, though?
But here's the thing. Unless we are talking about, well, even with a sortition system, you're still going to have, you're not going to instantly wave a magic wand and make everything socialist all at once. History's proven that. The places where they've tried to wave a magic wand and make socialism happen instantly, the best place I can think of is Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. It didn't work out so well. Because
the Khmer Rouge were backed by the United States because they saw them as rivals.
The United States and China. This is the complicated period of the Cold War.
And China, interesting.
The Khmer Rouge.
Oh, wait. The Soviets were more pro.
The Soviets backed Vietnam.
Right.
China, after the Sino-Soviet split and the meetings between Mao and Nixon, and especially after Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford pulled troops out, the U.S. State Department and the Chinese Foreign Ministry basically made a deal that China would take over the U.S.'s projects in Indochina the same way that the U.S. had taken over for France. So the Khmer Rouge was backed by both China and the U.S. for the express purpose of weakening Vietnam and, as a result, the Soviet Union.
Which is not to say that the Soviets didn't make deals with the American. For example, Brezhnev in the late 60s, shortly before that period, had a deal with Johnson that the United States would no longer back counter-revolution in Eastern Europe. In exchange, the Soviets would no longer back revolutions in Latin America. And that coincided with Che's operation in Bolivia. It's part of the reason why he was sabotaged. Because Brezhnev was more of a Stalinist figure because by then Khrushchev had stepped down.
Brezhnev was conservative with a small c, is the way to put it.
Right.
And that he was very much the bureaucratic socialist of the Stalinist stage, where the authoritarian bureaucracy makes the decisions and people follow the rules.
By the way, have you ever read Khrushchev's autobiography, Khrushchev Remembers?
I should. I have. I've read Trotsky's autobiography, but not Khrushchev's.
Oh, my life. Yeah, but I've read Khrushchev's too. There's not a lot of copies of it, but I've read it. And I'm not going to say I agree with everything in it, but it gives a lot of interesting perspectives.
Well, so I have very mixed feelings about the Soviet revisionists. Obviously, Gorbachev was a sellout in the end. I don't know what to think about Khrushchev.
He had a great
I
foreign
do know that
policy.
Brezhnev was not in any
Because
way a
think about it.
progressive
Khrushchev
or
supported the Cuban
forward-thinking
Revolution.
figure.
Khrushchev supported the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah.
Had he stayed in power a couple more years, he probably would have supported Che in Bolivia. There could have been a different outcome. So his foreign policy was good, and he was even trying to make peace with the United States without selling out, like Brezhnev did. He was making deals with Kennedy, and Kennedy, within a few months of his assassination, the Stalinists conspire, the Cold Warriors and the Soviet Union conspire against Khrushchev, and they force him out. So I don't think the timing's coincidental.
Oh, I don't think it's completely coincidental either. And there were several meetings and deals between Nixon and Brezhnev as well. Remember, the first SALT treaty happened between Nixon and Brezhnev. SALT 1.
And, divide and conquer is what the imperialists do. So Nixon, Johnson, took
and
advantage
if you don't
of the
remember,
Soviet
folks, SALT 1 was the first strategic arms limitation treaty. It was the first voluntary agreement between the U.S. and the USSR to limit nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I know that Kennedy and Khrushchev were planning to do that, but that didn't materialize, right?
Well, there wasn't the Khrushchev. It's really hard to say what Kennedy was planning to do. There were so many stories, and I can't believe them all.
Khrushchev and Kennedy met face to face in Vienna.
Yes,
and in Vienna there was a lot of talks to
and Khrushchev and Kennedy got along much better than Eisenhower and Khrushchev, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. As funny as that is, and
it's ironic, right? Because Eisenhower, who was more hawkish with Khrushchev, warned in his farewell address about the military-industrial complex.
Well, thing is, Eisenhower,
and he was not hawkish when it came to Egypt, so he wasn't hawkish on every issue.
Eisenhower was what I would call a soft power hawk and a hard power dove.
Mm-hmm.
Eisenhower was very much against sending U.S. troops into other countries to fight wars. Eisenhower thought war was the worst thing in the world because he was a soldier and he had fought in the worst war ever.
World War II.
Well, the two worst wars ever. He also fought in World War I under MacArthur. Ironic fact, MacArthur was Eisenhower's commanding officer in World War I.
Oh, I didn't know that. But what about Patton? Did Patton fight in World War I as well?
They all fought in World War I.
Yeah.
Eisenhower.
I would say that Eisenhower during World War II was just as important as Soleimani was in Iraq at the time that Trump assassinated.
And Eisenhower was when during the period where MacArthur was general of the army under Hoover.
Mm-hmm.
Eisenhower was his chief of staff. So Eisenhower was a subordinate of MacArthur for most of his career, which is why he chose to run for president as a Republican to stop MacArthur from getting the nomination.
Interesting.
He was asked by Truman to run as a Democrat. Truman agreed to not run if Eisenhower would run as a Democrat. And Truman ended up not running anyway.
Well, wasn't the vice president, or he was for only a short time as vice president, trying to remember his name, Wallace of FDR.
Henry Wallace
he was kind of a socialist, right? And then they opted for Truman instead.
Well, so the history is interesting. So FDR's first president was John Nance Garner, who was a Texas congressman who had been Speaker of the House.
His first VP, right?
His first VP.
Yeah.
Garner had wanted to be the presidential nominee, but ended up as FDR's running mate instead. And Garner's supporters made a lot of talk about, this is a kangaroo ticket. It's stronger in the bottom than in the top. Saying that Garner was going to be the real president if FDR won.
Right.
And of course, FDR won and Garner was sidelined. And when the New Deal really got going, FDR picked Henry Wallace for his reelection.
Not only that, the reason why the New Deal was successful was because there was a coup attempt that was exposed by Smedley Butler. Yes. And FDR went behind the scenes and said, look, here's the evidence that I have against you guys trying to plot against me. unless you want to be tried for treason, you're going to back off and let me institute this new deal that I'm working on with the socialists. And then he brought on Wallace, right?
And Wallace became his new Wallace was his new vice president when he was reelected, was his new running mate when he was reelected. And Wallace was the New Deal vice president.
Yeah, Wallace is more of a socialist now.
And he was also the World War II vice president. But when they knew that Roosevelt was probably going to die, they didn't want Wallace to be president, and the Democratic Party made Roosevelt replace Wallace on the ticket with Truman if he wanted to run again.
Right.
And I would have preferred Wallace stay, but, it happened the way it happened.
Didn't Wallace run as a third party later on?
Wallace ran as a third party, and the USSR endorsed him. And he and the KGB actually offered to help him with his campaign, and he turned them into the FBI. Because he didn't want to get in any trouble.
That's during the Cold War.
Yeah. But that discredited him with a lot of his more left-wing supporters when he turned the KGB agents in.
Yeah.
And so, okay, maybe he's not socialist enough. He doesn't want to be president.
But he could have been an anti-Stalinist leftist. He considered the KGB agents kind of authoritarians.
Well, I mean, he probably was, but at the same time, I have complicated feelings. The worst things Stalin did are not the things he gets accused of by people who hate Stalin.
Well, yeah, for example, the famine claims on Ukraine are largely embellished.
Well, even Robert Conquest, who wrote the defining book about the Holodomor, admitted, hey, I was wrong and made a lot of it up. When he actually got to read the actual Soviet records, he was like, yeah, I made mistakes. But then the Black Book of Communist people quote all his stuff about the Holodomor totally uncritically.
Yeah,
no. And there were other things like it. The main reason for the famine was because the bureaucracy was not. Bureaucrats are not policy people.
Right.
And while bureaucrats might be the best people to run a system, bureaucrats are not the best people to make policy for a system.
Right, which means implementation is a problem.
Exactly. Especially if the bureaucrats are are the ones ultimately in charge of their own policy. Under Lenin and Trotsky, well, Lenin, I should say, but it was Trotsky's system. The original system of commissars was to keep an eye on the bureaucrats and military people to make sure that they were being honest and trustworthy party people. But under Stalin, the system of commissars became a system for enforcing loyalty to the party among the party people, as opposed to making sure the party people were actually behaving themselves.
Trotsky talked a lot about the rise of the bureaucracy under Stalin. Yeah, so that's what he was referring to, because the role of the commissars changed in that regard.
Instead of the commissars, who were originally outside the bureaucracy and whose purpose was to police the bureaucracy for the Communist Party, ended up becoming a bureaucratized system of patronage.
Well, thanks for having me on, Chris. It's been a great conversation as usual.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate your time. I hope you have a great night. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Remember, you can follow me at Eclectic Radical on Twitter. You can follow the show at The Eclectic Rad on Twitter. And, of course, my Patreon is right here if you feel motivated to support the show. So thank you very much, and we'll tweet at you.